When last we left you, Lieutenant Thomas Boyd was surrounded by British and Indian armies during the Revolutionary War. How did he get there? He disobeyed some orders, he made some mistakes, and he ended up, well, we're about to find out how he ended up on this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. As always, it's brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Linden Honey Lake Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of the tragic story of Thomas Boyd. Joining us again is Mike Karpovage. He is an author and historian of Masonic things and other things. He'll continue the story, but in case you missed it, let's kind of return back to where we were, recap a little bit of last week. Remember, whoa, there we go, a live action audience there. We have a Freemason by the name of King George III. He's obviously on one side of the war, and on the other side we have who else but none other than George Washington. Yet another Freemason. George Washington was matching wits with King George's generals. On one side in the Western New York area, aligned with the Tories, with the British, were the Indian chief was also a Freemason, Joseph Brant. He's a Mohawk Indian chief, and he was really brought up by the British, and that's how he became a Mason, and he was very well regarded. Along with him, on the side of the British, was the Freemason Colonel John Butler. He was up against, on the American side, Major General John Sullivan, also a Freemason. And these people got together in Western New York, sort of on purpose, during Sullivan's March. And Sullivan's March sort of went through the interior of the Western New York region. And here is the part that we're going to focus on. It is towards the end of the march, Thomas Boyd was sent out by Sullivan to scout a potential village for Sullivan's army to ransack. And this is where everything happened. Sullivan disobeyed. He didn't really disobey orders on purpose. He didn't follow orders. Let's say it that way. It's a little nicer. And as a result of several mistakes that he made, he ended up getting ambushed. And that's where we are at this point in time. So let's pick it up from there. Mike, can you just describe for us again what it was like? Lead us up into this ambush point. What mistake really kind of triggered this ambush? I guess there were 2 mistakes, but kind of go over those again.
Okay, so Freemason Lieutenant Thomas Boyd, one of Sullivan's scouts, was ordered to recon, trying to get up to the Genesee Castle, which was going to be their last target to destroy. Sullivan asked him to take 4 of his best scouts, go that night, recon, report back in the morning, don't make contact with the enemy. Thomas Boyd took 29 scouts and some Indian guides, Oneida Indian guides that are loyal to the rebel cause. The next morning, they stopped. They went 6 miles. They were 2 miles from Genesee Castle. The next morning, they were in this tiny little village. You saw 2 Indians, and they fired on them, killing one, wounding the other. He made escape, so their contact was blown. Their stealth was blown originally. Their contact was now blown from the shots. The dead Indian was at Tuscarora, and Timothy Murphy took his scalp. So they had to make their way back. Then another bad judgment by Boyd was several enemy Indians appeared, and and Boyd was suckered in. He was baited in to chasing them. His Indian guide, Han Yost, told him, don't do it. So he didn't listen to his Indian guide, gave chase. Murphy killed another Indian, scalped him. And ultimately, Boyd led his group of scouts into the waiting ambush of Butler and Brant's warriors that were at the top of this ravine, waiting for the full army of Sullivans to come up so they could ambush them that morning. So here comes Boyd into Butler's right flank, hearing firing, and next thing you know, Boyd is surrounded. His guys are surrounded. Now they have to take cover on a knoll, and there's a group of trees up there. It was a grove, described as a grove, but they had clear fields of fire, and they were able to get off 3 volleys against the Indians and the Rangers. Now Boyd knew that he had to focus his fire in mass in one section of the line in order to create a breakthrough. So the first volley, they downed many of the enemy because these scouts are marksmen. And next, Boyd's scouts started falling dead, wounded, and there was a third volley. Okay, that's when Murphy led the charge to break through. So 8 scouts were able to break through. Murphy led that charge, and while he was, hitting the line, a big Indian warrior was right in front of him. So Murphy just bowled him right over, and flipped him over. And I guess at the time the other Indians laughed about it. So, right in the thick of battle and death, and you have laughter from just someone doing like a football tackle. Anyways, Murphy was chased by 2 Indians. So basically the guys that got out scattered to get back to the main army, which was just like a mile away. Murphy was chased by 2 Indians. He outran them, but then those leggings that he stole, that he took off the body of the old Tuscarora, they proved too tight, and it was hampering his running because he was like the fastest runner in the scout corps. So he had cut his leggings off, and then he was pursued by another Indian, and Murphy put a ball in his chest, killed him, scalped him. I don't know. It's like, what is like his 35th, 36th scalp at that point. Made his way back to the main army and raised the alarm. Now back on the hill, the rest of Boyd's men were just massacred. It came down to hand-to-hand combat, and the firing of the muskets were so close that the black powder was burned into the bodies. There was they found the butts of the rifles and guns smashed, freshly smashed, meaning those were used as like clubs. So the rest of his guys were killed, and then Boyd was shot in the side. So he was wounded. He couldn't make escape. Sergeant Michael Parker and Boyd were captured along with Han Yost, the Oneida Indian guide. So you have the three Americans, the rebels, and Han and Yost. The 3 of them were captured. Okay, and his other guys are dead or dying. The Indians and the Rangers were scalping, finishing off Boyd's scouts, and then Han Yost's brother, who was fighting for Brant and Butler, recognizes him, and they go face to face. Words are exchanged, and then all of a sudden, Chief Littlebeard of the Seneca, brutal warrior, hits Han Yost in the back of the head with a tomahawk, drops him, And then those Indians proceed to chop up Han Yost right in front of Boyd. So it's at that point Boyd knew his fate, and he had one last cry for help, if you will, to survive. And that is when he asked for an audience with Chief Joseph Brant right there on the battlefield. And this is where we get into the Masonic hail sign of distress.
Before we get into that, Mike, just a kind of a curious thing. So Murphy, an American, was taking scalps, just like the Indians did. Now, was that a normal thing, or was he doing it just as a
Yes.
sign of retribution? So other Americans, did British take scalps too?
Oh yeah, British were paying people to take scalps because it was proof. It was proof of, if someone had a bounty on their head. You'd take scalps. It's also a trophy. It's a trophy, and it has a sense of spirituality in the warrior world. So this goes back, way back, where you, having killed your enemy, you would scalp him because you were in control of his soul now. Okay.
I see.
So
did this come from
so they
Europe?
were not I don't know where it originated, but it's they're trophies. It shows how you can, as a warrior, you can engage in hand-to-hand combat, get close with the enemy, shows off your strength. It has that spiritual sense too, where you're, with death, you're in control of another soul. So it's, so it was a practice back then.
Fascinating. So let's get back to the story. We've got Joseph Brant and Thomas Boyd meeting. So what happened after that?
So I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the witnesses on the field, because there was a couple of scouts that hid under a log in the grass, and then everyone left the field. So we have witnesses from both sides, actually. So I'm going to read an excerpt about what happened at that point. So when Lieutenant Boyd found himself a prisoner, whom he solicited an interview with Brant at that point, right? And this chief, who was at the moment near, immediately presented himself when Lieutenant Boyd, by one of those appeals which are known only by those who have been initiated and instructed in certain mysteries, and which never fail to bring succor to a distressed brother, addressed him as the only source from which he could expect a respite from cruel punishment or death. Okay, this is the Masonic appeal. The appeal was recognized in Brant immediately, and in the strongest language assured Boyd that his life would be spared. Okay, so now Boyd and Parker are under Chief Brant's protection, personal protection and Masonic protection. Now they are taken to Genesee Castle, a few miles away. And at that point, Brant had to go back to the battlefield. Okay, Sullivan's army is coming. So he had his duties to do too. So he left, and he placed Boyd and Parker under Colonel Butler's control, right? And Butler's a Mason too. At that point, Butler proceeds to interrogate Thomas Boyd to get intelligence on Sullivan's army. And he threatens him, and he says, if you don't tell me everything I ask of you, I will give you to the Indians and they will torture you to death. So Boyd refuses. He says, no, I'm under Masonic protection with Brant. You can't kill me. This is this is what we do as brothers, and you have an obligation to save my life, right? So Boyd was interrogated, and from the research I found, he gave up the farm to Butler. He gave number of troops, who the generals were, how much supplies they had, where their garrisons were, the fact that they were going to Genesee Castle, and then the army was going to turn around. So Boyd gave everything up, but then Butler proceeded to still give him to the Indians, and the torture that was inflicted upon him is, in my opinion, the most heinous murder in American military history.
We'll get to the details of that, and there are details from both sides right after this message.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to the State of Greater Western New York Report. This week we're talking about Thomas Boyd, the fate of Thomas Boyd in the sort of the early years of the Revolutionary War here in the Western New York region. Mike, tell us a little bit. By the way, Mike Karpovage is an author and a historian who is really relaying this story. If you have a question for him, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll relay the question to him. But I had a question right at the beginning, right off the bat, and we're about to get into the details of the torture. Tell us a little bit about the sources. How do we know the details as much as we do? And the details are very detailed, very graphic. How did we find out about those?
Well, Sullivan's officers, soldiers, they kept journals of this entire expedition. So I was able to get a hold of those journals that were put into digitized format when I was working at SUNY Tompkins Cortland Community College. Professor knew I was writing this book about this subject. So she had found in Germany a digital archive with these journals. So I was able to get a hold of the PDFs, I believe, of like 20 different journals. So you can see on that day, you can see like 8 different soldiers' accounts that I took excerpts from of their eyewitness testimony as to what happened. And then when they found Thomas Boyd and Michael Parker the next day, and how their bodies were just destroyed, you can paint this picture. Okay, so not only did you have the Sullivan's officers' journals, but you also had on the other side too, in particular, Mary Jemison. Now, Mary Jemison was kidnapped by the Seneca Indians when she was 15, a white girl, and she was raised by the Seneca in Littlebeard's town. We're talking about Chief Littlebeard, his Seneca. So she was 36 years old at the time of this incident. She knew the Butlers, Brant, many of the Rangers, right? So her eyewitness testimony corroborates the other eyewitness testimony. She published a memoir in 1824. It's a best-selling book, and it's called The Life of Mary Jemison, the White Woman. So that's a great source. We also have In 1889, in Livingston County Historical Society, a newsletter, we also have other accounts too of what happened. So there's many sources to this. Some of the numbers of who died, how many scouts there were, how many Indians and Rangers there were, are a little iffy, but pretty much the stories coincide.
So let's get into the details here, and we're going to tell everybody that this is going to be somewhat graphic. So you're not going to see any pictures; you're just going to hear the words as they're described. But Mike, tell us what those journals relayed in terms of the actual torture itself.
Yeah, and I think it's important to hear this because this, so for the most part, we think the Revolutionary War is kind of romanticize it in film and what have you, but all throughout human history, there's brutality and atrocities in war, and no matter if we're in the most modern civilized society today, we still do the same things to people. So here's an account of what happened. I'm going to read this. The prisoners were seized, stripped, and bound to trees, and severely whipped with prickly ash bows. The Indians commenced a series of horrid cruelties directed especially toward Thomas. When all was ready, Littlebeard lifted his hatchet, stained with recent blood, and with steady aim sent it whistling through the air, and in an instant it quivered within a hair's thickness of Thomas's head. The younger Indians were now permitted to follow the chief's example, and from right, front, and left their bright tomahawks cleaved the air and trembled above the unflinching persons of the victims. Wearied at length of this work, a single blow severed Parker's head from his body and mercifully ended his misery. Poor Thomas, however, was reserved for a worse fate. An incision was made in his abdomen, and a severed intestine was fastened to a tree. He was then scourged with prickly ash bows again and compelled to move around until the pain was so great that he could go no farther. Again pinioned to the tree, his mouth was then enlarged with a knife. Okay, his nails were dug out. His tongue was torn away. Both of his ears were severed from his head. His nose was chopped off and then thrust into his mouth. His eyes were dug out, and the flesh was cut from his shoulder. And then, sinking in death after the enormities, he was decapitated, and his disfigured head, after being partly skinned, was raised by the frenzied savages upon a sharpened pole, and a knife was stuck into his body when it was found. The village was then abandoned, and the corpses were left for the dogs to gnaw on them. And that is how Sullivan found them. And they were so disgusted at what had happened, you can see in the journals that they wouldn't even repeat like some of the things that happened to them. So they were so shooken up too. So yeah, that's what the fate of Thomas Boyd was. And that tree today exists. It's called the torture tree. It's called the Boyd Parker Torture Tree Park. It's right near Groveland, south of Geneseo. You can visit that tree there. There's a memorial there too for the fallen. And there's also a memorial too at the ambush site to the east.
There's actually a picture. We had a question about where's this located. So here's right. A map of it. So go ahead.
So this is the ambush site, correct? And it's just at the foot of Canisius Lake, up the ravines, and it's at Gray's Corners. Was it? Gray Hill Road, and there's a little park there. There's a memorial to those that were fallen. It's nice. It's very well kept. It's a somber place. And you can see it was right at the top of that ravine and right at the foot of Conesus Lake. That's where the army was. So he was that close to getting back.
Here's a satellite view. You can't really see the topography as much, but you get a sense for the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a marker.
Now this marker, so Sullivan buried the bodies there, I believe at the torture tree. They said it was under some plum trees. And then years later, the bodies were interred up at Mount Hope Cemetery in a very patriotic ceremony. I think in 1841, I believe, not sure, but yeah, 1841. It's on Patriots Hill in Mount Hope Cemetery. So you had Han Yost, Boyd, Parker. So yeah, I visited there too.
That's actually right here in Rochester that that he was moved up to be buried in, and like you say, that was a very patriotic sort of ceremony that occurred, and I believe there was another ceremony that occurred about 100 years after the event, and William Tecumseh Sherman came and spoke to that one. So it was a well-known event within our communities, within the greater Western New York region, for at least the first 100 years of America's existence. Today, you hardly hear anything about it. Why do you think that might be the case?
Because we're so distracted by just, moronic stuff these days. Yeah, it's just one of those tragic battles in history. And, I do want to say before we sum up that, Butler was a Mason, and that's where I think he betrayed Thomas Boyd. And Butler claimed he couldn't control the vengeful Indians, right? He also said, the Indians wanted to kill Boyd because Murphy killed the Tuscarora. Okay, but there's no evidence of that. And then Butler also claimed that an old Indian came up and tomahawked Thomas Boyd in the head while we were transporting him to Fort Niagara. Okay, that's not true. Eyewitness testimony. So the Butlers, Walter and John, Walter was his son, the captain, they never denied this, and they never took responsibility. They never confirmed or denied this story. Now, I came across a letter to Butler sent a letter to his superior, and it says that Boyd gave up all the goods on the during the interrogation. So, Thomas shouldn't have been sent for torture. And Butler did state, though, any Masonic obligations were overruled by the duty of an army officer to serve his king and must not be invoked to protect rebels. His loyalty was to King George III and the monarchy, not to a fellow Mason. So, and the Butlers, they were just a nasty pair. Captain Walter Butler, he got his just dues by an Oneida Indian who killed and scalped him later on.
Mike, tell us a little bit about your venture into this historical reenactment sort of thing through your books of fiction. Tell us how your history has informed you as you've written these books. We have a couple of seconds left, so you need to be quick.
Okay. Yeah, so go on Amazon.com. There's free PDFs of the first 3 chapters of each book. You'll want to start with Crown of Serpents, where in the opening preface, I reenact that scene in 1779 where Boyd is under fire and he is captured and how he is stripped. One of the things that were taken was his journal, and that journal shows up in an archaeological dig at Fort Niagara in the present day. So that's how things get started. I interweave that's a word. I combine historical fact with fiction and into these adventurous treasure hunting type mystery thriller books.
So they're a combination of National Treasure and Indiana Jones, I think, is the way I've seen them described. And I'm actually reading them. They're fascinating. I enjoy them. You did a really good job, Mike, in how you set it up. And I want to thank. Oh, go ahead.
And if anyone's interested in some of the research I did or would like to speak with me, visit karpovagecreative.com.
All right. So, Mike, thanks for being a part of today's show. I want to thank the listeners who are watching, or the viewers, I guess you'd call them. And if you're interested in being a part of the live audience where you can ask questions to our guests, it's simple. It's free. You just sign up at stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, and you will be put on the email list that goes out every Thursday prior to the show, which gives you the secret entry point to the live studio audience where, yes, you can ask questions. If you're not at the live studio audience, don't worry, the show's archived every week. You can get it there. Or if you like us on our Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel, when the show is rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30, you will be notified at that point. And with that, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll see you all next week.